Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you in Eastern Canada, good afternoon. For those of you in Western Canada, good morning. I'm Lee Gould, the Executive Director for the Canadian Association of Government Finance Officers, CAGFO. We're thrilled that you could join us today for our very timely presentation from Kathy Parker of PwC around resilience and returning to the workplace. I'm very excited about this topic. I would be remiss if I didn't invite you to check out CAGFO's website at cagfo.ca to review our various professional development opportunities, including our annual national conference, now going virtual. We're offering some really interesting speakers from formerly from the Parliamentary Budgetary Office, some senior economists from banks, and even some folks from finance think tanks and whatnot. Please check out the website, but more importantly, please pay attention to Kathy. We'll hold the questions till the end of our presentation, but feel free to use the questions tab on the right side of your screen. Over to you, Kathy.
Great. Well, listen, thanks very much, Lee and Anne, and thanks to all of you for joining today. I'm Kathy Parker, and I am a partner with PricewaterhouseCoopers Consulting. I'm based out of Toronto, although was born and raised in Western Canada. And, delighted to be here to talk about this topic. I spend a lot of my time talking about, as the title page suggests, and helping my clients sort out what we're calling their new world, new skills types of challenges. Obviously, over the ensuing, whatever it is now, 15, 16 weeks, we've layered a whole new set of challenges on top of what was already driving some very important considerations and conversations around how automation and digitization is affecting us, whether we're in government, whether we're in retail, whatever industry. It's clearly having an impact on the workforce. And it's also having an impact more specifically on the skills and capabilities that people need as well. So we've now, as I say, layered COVID and the pandemic and some of the implications of all of that on top of that to create an even more interesting and rich picture. And that's really what I want to focus on today is to talk to you about how do we not only move forward, to return to the office, return to workplace, whatever way one wants to characterize it as, but in doing that, it's also really about you can't do that in isolation of thinking about how do we also think longer term, because these things are really commingled and it's really hard, as I say, to compartmentalize them. So just in terms of today's discussion, really, we're going to focus in on predominantly on two things, but I am going to leave you with a few messages at the end. So the idea is, first and foremost, we want to talk about the current landscape and a little bit more about thinking about planning for and ultimately executing against return to work. What are some of the things that you need to think about? What does that look like? But the other thing, as I said, you can't think about return to work in isolation necessarily, because there are implications for how you work differently going forward from here as well too. We were chatting a bit before the call started, and I think as I was sharing, one of the things that's very clear to us at PwC, and certainly I know to others, is that there is probably some measure of folks who will continue to work remotely for a period of time. Again, not everybody is going to go to the Shopify model where 90+ or so % of your folks will continue to work virtually. But now I think we've tapped into something that will change the model of working as well as the capabilities required to support that model. So we're going to touch on that. And then, as I said, I will leave you with some messages to consider. So, just as I said, let's start with the current state of play and really that thinking about, how do we get back to work? And I certainly know, and I was sharing with the other folks, that there's, probably a range of things that I'm seeing out there that are happening. You've probably got, and again, it very much does depend on the type of organization that you're dealing with. Certainly, I would imagine for government finance officers, this is largely about returning to the office space or thinking about what does the remote work possibility look like for you. So really, this whole notion of working remotely that's come off of the pandemic has really created that need to, ease into the office, but also to ease into whatever is the next normal. And as part of that thinking, it's really created a number of questions that we see leaders wrestling with, and certainly that we're trying to help them to think about as well too. So just even starting with, how do we plan for return to workplace? That begs a whole series of questions, and I'll share a framework with you in a couple of minutes, but thinking about things like, how do we ultimately, if this is an 18-month journey or a 6-month journey, how do we plan on that basis? What do we need to do to orchestrate it? So there's so many questions that surround that very first point. One of the other things, though, that this is, also causing people to think about is, what does good look like then when we come back? And by that we mean, are there things that will need to change how we operate? Just the fact that, maybe organizations are looking at when they do come back, it will be quite, it may be on a much more reduced basis. Maybe it will be 15% or 20% or maybe 25% capacity. But largely speaking, certainly the big organizations that are office-based that I've encountered are not looking at anywhere near a full cadre of people returning to work. So how does that then affect the way we operate or our operating model? The third point is really about then, if we are thinking about how we need to operate differently, one of the things that this whole ability to work remotely has also proven, though, is that we're actually a lot more capable. We're a lot more agile with this than we probably imagined that we would be in the first place. So how do we actually, and I know so many people try to attribute this to anyone from Rahm Emanuel to Winston Churchill. I don't know if it's ever been resolved fully, but the quote about never let a good crisis go to waste. How do we actually take advantage and extract some of the good stuff out of this and use it to, to improve how we do things, but also, not only to make our place where we a better, more efficient, more effective place, but also ultimately to deliver better and differently to our clients or customers as well. And then the fourth point is really about saying, if we look differently at work as we move forward or as we return to office, one of the things that's probably proven to us is that we have to think differently too about productivity and how we actually look at productivity. How do we measure productivity? How do we think about success? And a lot of that's predicated on that notion that if we have, maybe 20% of people actually return to the office, but that other 80% that is out there still working remotely, for example, how do we understand and work with them differently? How do we, as leaders, for example, or managers, how do we manage their performance when they're remote from us? So many of our systems are very traditionally geared to what I can see around me in terms of performance management. So this presents some new and interesting challenges for us as we go forward. And then the last point is really about, this is also forcing us to think about, as organizations, where do we invest? Where do we put our resources going forward? Does this, in the spirit of taking advantage of this to help transform what we do, what do we need to stop doing maybe? And if we decide on what we need to continue doing or do more of, how does that shape where we invest, and particularly in people? What are the skills that we need? What are the new ways of working in that will support that? So all of these become important questions that leaders really do need to consider and wrestle with as we step forward into this new and uncharted territory. One of the things I mentioned is that, you know, never let a good crisis go to waste, or that notion of not letting a good crisis go to waste. You know, the whole pandemic and the onset of it and what it's meant for work and the workforce in general. And obviously it's been very devastating for many people. I certainly do not want to in any way, shape, or form diminish that. But what it's done is it's certainly also, it's not just created challenges, but it's amplified ones that were already there. Ones that, you know, people were starting to become much more attuned to in terms of thinking about skills and thinking about automation and what does it actually mean for our workforce as we go forward. What COVID's done is really accelerated the notion that there is a new world of work that's actually emerging out of this. So I want to touch on a few points though that have been important and as I say, amplified around this. So, you know, thinking about trusted employers and what we really mean by that is that this whole piece and what we've been doing and how employers have been acting through the course of the pandemic has really put organizations and the experience they create for their employees in the spotlight. So it's shone a light on, you know, how employers go about creating that relationship with their employees. The people that are really good at it are the ones who are going to come through this probably in a better place. But you know, for those who may not have had as strong a track record, there's no reason to despair, obviously. I think the point here is that employers are playing a more important role in terms of, and there's more probably opportunity out of this, if you will, to actually connect with and build the right relationship with your employees. This is really about, you know, solidifying the trust that your people have. Again, clearly where people have had to lay people off and things like that, that's not the best situation. But I think for organizations who, you know, stood sort of solidly around this, they've done a lot of things. They've focused on employee wellness. They've been very attuned to understanding how my employees are feeling. What do I need to understand about how they're working now that they're working at home? All of these have become very important considerations. And again, things that you need to build on as you contemplate whether it's return to the office or whether we're working remotely on a more ongoing basis. One of the other things, as I said, that, you know, the pandemic has done is it's continued to highlight or amplify on challenges around particular skills. So, you know, prior to the pandemic, we were certainly seeing this from a PwC perspective, but there are also lots of other research bodies who've been acknowledging that senior executives, CEOs, heads of organizations, government, private sector, not-for-profit, they're all acknowledging that there's a challenge in terms of skills and the availability of some of the skills that they truly need for their organizations to be able to thrive in a digital, an increasingly digital world, but also now in particular in a post-pandemic type of economy. So, and that gets to the third point, finding those people who have the right skills and the right fit to your organization. I know this seems counterintuitive, but in many respects, it's actually harder now than it would have been before. And I know from our business, we're certainly seeing our competitor organizations, you know, continue to reach out to our people, for example, to see if there's an opportunity to pick up people with the skills that they need. So we can't ignore the fact that having the right skills or the ability and access to people with the right skills is something that is, or we can't operate under the false pretense that it's something that is going to actually be easier now, because if anything, it will continue to get harder. I already mentioned sort of a pressure on productivity and particularly things like how you mention that or how you measure productivity too. What this has done certainly is it's shone a light on the need for having clear ways to measure productivity, but also to how you understand productivity with your employees as well, particularly when they are remote. One of the things we're certainly seeing, and this, all of these points are related, but this goes back in part to the first point on trust. One of the things that we're seeing is that, I guess one of the things remote working has done is it's created less of a separation or an ability to compartmentalize between work and between home. And so, yes, productivity has gone up quite significantly in many instances, but we also have to weigh it at a certain cost in terms of employee experience. I know obviously for other organizations, though, on the other hand, productivity may be a challenge, but certainly I would say in more office-like settings, that productivity increase I would expect has been certainly a common theme that I've heard when I've been speaking with people. Again, that emphasis on having the right skills, and not only before the pandemic, but increasing with the pandemic, has also it's also connected to the accelerated need for digital transformation. So obviously one of the things that might have challenged some organizations was sort of the basic level of digital literacy of people going into this. And some organizations perhaps weren't as equipped as others to work remotely effectively. A lot of us, however, have definitely figured it out and done well. But nonetheless, this has really heightened that need to understand what is the digital environment that I need to put in place and surround my teams with so that they can thrive, not only now, but as we press forward when we think about what's next in terms of the world of work and the kinds of automations that will continue, if not accelerate, whether it's artificial intelligence, process automation, all of these things will continue and accelerate in terms of importance. One of the other points that we've understood is that there's a rebalancing, if you will, of the labor market taking place. And what we mean by that is this is something that's continuing. It's in the sense that it's really sort of focusing in on the skills that are needed, but also the PIC has kind of highlighted now that perhaps the location of those skills may be less relevant to me. So I'm not sure for folks who might read HBR or geek out the way I do, but there was a nice little conversation with about 4 or 5 business leaders that was in the last edition. And basically, I think it was the head of Cisco that talked about the fact that what this has done is it's ideally opened up the pool of talent that's available to him now because, and notwithstanding the tax implications of this, so I will certainly defer to my global mobility colleagues at PwC, but it does provide me more opportunity to have people, even in Canada, if I'm working in one government, the people that I have, one provincial government, perhaps it's Ontario, what this has done is, conceivably suggested that maybe the people I need can work actually in British Columbia or Alberta or Manitoba. They don't need to actually live and reside in Ontario. So again, this is sort of created, I guess, if you will, or contributed to the rebalancing piece of this. The other thing we've talked about is sort of what we're calling a need for fewer people, perhaps, in the value chain. And what we mean by that is through automation and things like that, yes, it probably does emphasize or create a need for fewer people, but what it does is it also highlights and heightens the importance of the people and the human skills that are attached to that value chain. And then finally, and this is going back to what I started out with and what we were discussing before the session, what this has definitely done is highlighted the importance of organizational resilience and agility. And again, when we talk about the capabilities from a people perspective, so the skills, the experience and behaviors that people will need to have to thrive in today's and future worlds of work, resilience and agility tend to consistently be at the top of the list, along with data acumen and data visualization and all those other kinds of skills, because those human skills, as I like to call them, go hand in hand with those. So just to kind of continue on that theme, there is a lot of good that can be extracted from some of what we've had to experience with this. And I think what this has highlighted, for example, in the first bullet is that the whole era, the whole sort of focus of what we've done is it's really sort of re-emphasized the importance of organizations to focus in on purpose and to have a clear sense of purpose and what they're doing. That trust relationship with employees is usually strongest in what we call purpose-led organizations. And so government organizations, certainly many of the ones that I have worked with, whether it's at the federal level or ministries of environment at the provincial level, those to me are always great examples of purpose-led organizations. And so it tends to be an easier place from which to start to have the right relationship or build the right relationship with your employees. But again, this is also too, as I say, it's emphasizing for others who are perhaps less purpose-led that there is an important role that they play in doing the right things for society. I mentioned on the prior slide, so I'll just sort of glance through this. Well-being and employee engagement have become absolutely universally important or critical priorities for organizations. So, you know, the thing that I've observed with this is, whereas employee wellness was something that, you know, was certainly on people's agendas, and you had your benefit providers typically talk to you about wellness, and it's been there obviously for 10 or more years now. However, I would say it's absolutely accelerated to becoming one of the top priorities that is consistently part of conversations I'm having with HR and other business leaders, particularly again since the onset of the pandemic and working remotely. And people are recognizing that productivity and wellness link and engagement link is one that is absolutely integral to how the organization can deliver on what it needs to deliver on. I mentioned the notion already of focusing in, you know, my value chain comment a couple of minutes ago, of focusing in and better using human skills. And this is really about saying, you know, the importance of these skills can't be underplayed, because this is not just as we cope with and as we understand and find ways to, you know, transform our workforces to digitally enable them. Those human skills, the empathy, emotional intelligence, resilience, agility, all of these will be equally important to that data wrangling and analytical and other skills. They work hand in hand with them, because humans still need to apply judgment at this point anyway over artificial intelligence. But it's about finding the right place and really emphasizing that in the right way. One of the other things too that the pandemic has obviously highlighted for us is that people can respond quickly. So the ability to make quicker, more agile decisions, even in large organizations, people have proven that they can do this. However, the ability to sustain that now has people thinking about those governance and decision-making models that they have, and thinking about how can I alter, how can I adapt those so that we continue to embed this same type of agile behavior and decision-making. One of the other things too that we would say, and I'll just touch on a couple of these, when we think about working remotely, it's really helped us focus on and understand, you know, as I said, the link between productivity and wellness. you know, it's also caused us to think about sick leave. Whether it's reduced, that may not be a good thing because it may mean people are not taking it when they should. But it's also caused us to probably bond in some respects around a shared sense of experience. So much more senior people in an organization are oftentimes now, or have been certainly, experiencing some of the same, you know, shared technological and other challenges, whether it's kids at home or things like that, through this piece. So there is a way that you somehow in that respect can really heighten or increase levels of engagement in your organization through that sense of shared experience. It's also too, in some respects, and this is my glass half full perspective, helped, you know, to focus on inclusivity and how we really make sure that we are focused on creating the right experience for people who, you know, may have particular types of physical and other challenges that they have to deal with. And so all of that to say that, you know, there are also, I should touch on the fact that, you know, organizations are also too now investing, and I think they've seen the need to perhaps even in many instances accelerate their investment in collaborative technology. So how do we continue to work together the right ways, as well as digital skilling? And I think, again, to kind of sum what this experience has sort of taught us is a lot of people don't want to go back to what was. In my conversations, and I've probably had about, I'm going to say 35 or 40 conversations over the past 15 weeks about this, and given several presentations, I would say that one of the most universally understood sentiments is that people don't want to go back to exactly what was. So how do people then apply that learning, apply what we've learned now, and continue to innovate going forward? And that's where that notion of citizen-led sort of innovation comes into play as well. I think there's lots of energy. I think there's lots of opportunity for this. So in terms of principles for return to work itself and creating those processes, let's focus a little bit on that. One of the things we know, and one of the things we as PwC have applied to ourselves, and for those who might be thinking over wanting to ask the questions, we are taking obviously a very deliberate and very measured approach about how we actually go back to work. So we are starting with some pilots. I think they were to start this month, but they might have pushed them out one more month in smaller centers. So we're looking at smaller relative centers compared to a couple of our offices. So our Oakville, Ontario office, for example, will be looking at going back. But again, I think we said something like a 15% capacity in terms of in the office versus, you know, anything more than that. So the vast majority then of folks will continue to work remotely. So as we do that, these principles have been absolutely integral for us, and we know that they are also equally applicable for others. We talk about prioritizing people first, second, and third. Your people can't work effectively, won't be effective if they are nervous, if they are scared, they won't be engaged. So creating an environment that is safe is about that prioritization for people. So we have to do that. That's the start point for all of this. Don't bring people back to the office unless you have to. And so we've had, as PwC, for example, we've had a skeleton staff of folks who are IT related or whatever working in our downtown Toronto office, for example. But literally, I mean a skeleton. It might be 1% of the staff who is normally there. So this is, and again, the approach we know, because having employees who feel comfortable, confident, and safe about going back will ensure that our clients and the people we work with get the best and feel comfortable, confident, and safe about engaging with us as well too. So don't bring people back to the office unless you have to. The other principle that we would think about is phase it. Again, this is what we're doing. We're thinking about things. And I know many government organizations, certainly federal government ones too, that I've spoken with have been doing this. They've been thinking about, and big centers as well, municipal governments would be thinking about this, but where you reside in office complexes and that, it becomes a challenge. I mean, literally, you know, in addition to the physical safety piece of this is predicated on a number of logistical challenges and the ability to address those. I know somebody mentioned for our office building downtown Toronto, for example, that literally, even on a reduced capacity, to safely get people up in elevators and adhere to local standards would take something like 4.5 to 5 hours a day to do that. So we know that that's not necessarily a viable way of doing this. So this is really about be deliberate, be thoughtful, and think about how you want to phase this. The other thing though is, while being deliberate, you need to also be flexible. We need to be ready to adjust and adapt quickly. And we've certainly, you know, proven that we can do that with the vast majority of organizations. But again, you know, our own sort of thinking and research on this is that there is likely another wave that will be coming. And if we assume that, that also means that we have to have a very good and adaptable system for quickly going into whatever form of lockdown we might need to go into again. So this is all about having that flexibility built into your system. But also too, recognizing those positive or silver linings. Again, a lot of this is, you know, on the plus side of this, this is really elevated and sort of raised the bar on how people have, the human side of people has really come out. And I think, as I said, this is an opportunity. It's a golden opportunity for managers and leaders to really show up and show their people how important they are, to find the ways to show them that they care on an individual basis. And more broadly speaking, for employers to be able to support their people in the right way and send the right signal. So I mentioned that we have a framework, and this is a bit of an eye chart, so I won't take you through all of it, but we do have a framework that we use at PwC, our own internal one. Maybe it looks slightly different, but essentially it covers these elements. And the real key elements here, and I mentioned this previously, it kind of starts with that whole notion of how do we create the right environment for our people? And the right environment for our people is one that is both physically safe and psychologically safe. So we talk a lot about this concept of psychological safety and what it means and how it works with physical safety. So obviously creating a safe environment, a physically safe environment, means that we have to understand all the relevant recommendations, guidance, and perhaps bylaws in many of our jurisdictions to say, how do we need to adapt our workplace to make it work for that? How can we then, and we have to use that as a basis to help us plan for and understand how do we need to adapt and who can we bring back? That becomes another important question. Do we have to bring people back? One of the biggest issues, particularly in larger centers, has been the issue of transportation to work, how that affects people's willingness to come back to a workplace. So the workplace itself may be fine and may be physically safe, but the consciousness of people is about taking public transit to get that workplace, and it's to that workplace. And it's not just about the act of taking public transit. If you take that back a step further in terms of how you understand the situations and the surroundings of your employees, you know, you may have somebody on your team, for example, who has someone at home that's immune compromised, who has a pregnant partner at home, who has a child that's going through some kind of medical treatment. All of these are good reasons for someone to not want to get on public transit necessarily when there is still fear of a virus being out there. So these are the kinds of considerations that need to be taken into account in terms of understanding who comes back to your workplace, whose work is also, as we call it, remotable. So whose work is most remotable? You know, could you have all of your administrative assistants continue to work remotely, for example? These are all the kinds of considerations that become part of this. Clearly, there is also a financial cost and implication to a lot of this. This has meant retrofitting facilities. It's meant changing how we adapt. It's meant providing people with laptops where perhaps they didn't previously have them. So these are all part of the cost aspects that we do need to understand, both for now and also even for the foreseeable future. And ultimately, too, we need to adapt HR policies to really reflect what is the normal of now and what is that potential remote work normal as well. So one of the tools, I just wanted to highlight one thing that we've been thinking about and talking about with as we plan for coming back, is the idea of leveraging something called a social contract. And basically, it's a contract between employers and employees. And what it does is, you've probably heard many people talk about this idea that we are all in this together. And so, as I said, this is one of those things that's created shared experience for, you know, leaders and staff. The social contract is a great example of something that, you know, in the spirit of shared experience, is a tool that could be employed to help people think about coming back. And so basically the premise is this: the employer says, under the terms of this social contract, these are the things, so the processes, the protocols, the tools that we will implement and leverage and provide so that you, employee, and our customers or clients can feel safe coming back, can feel safe interacting with us on site. The other side, of course, of that equation is what is my responsibility as an employee in that scenario? So what do I need to do? What do I sign up for? And, you know, that can even go as far as, you know, having a process which sort of basically employees have to apply to come back to work at the office, right? And this is about them committing to saying, I'm going to do certain things, whether it's I'm going to clean my space every day. I'm going to make sure that I do not leave the floor that I'm on during the day. I'm going to, you know, I'm going to wear a mask at all times. These are all the kinds of things that become part of my contribution to making this work as an employee if I want to and need to be back at the office. So I just highlight that as one example on that return to workplace kind of approach or thinking. On the other piece of this, some of what we're doing with clients is helping them, using the framework I talked about, plan for return to work, but we're also using that same framework to kind of challenge the plans that they're developing and help them think about, well, did you miss this? Or is this something you want to consider? So there's lots of ways as you start to go through that process to think about it, and tools, of course, to employ. So just to kind of sum this a bit, what I really wanted to highlight here is, as we think about both returning to work, but also working remotely, these things have sort of an implication for the future of work. So, you know, this is, and I mentioned some of this already, so I'm just going to glance at this quickly. This is really about emphasizing transferable skills. It's about ensuring that, you know, as I said, digital skills are part of the story, but there's a lot of human skills that the pandemic has highlighted and reinforced the importance of. This is about saying, now that I know what I know, plus what I was already contemplating, do I have the right mix of skills? Do I have the right strategy for my workforce to be able to create an environment that's engaging for them, where they will have the right experience and they will thrive. And also from a workplace, or creating the right environment for them, do I have a workplace that has the collaboration tools and a safe physical space for them to be able to work? Or do I have the remote workforce set up that will allow them to thrive and do the things that they need to do? And it's also too, as I say, and I'll get into this in a minute, about considering some different options, particularly for remote work. So looking forward from here, how do we move forward? This is just really quickly to say, look, we know that there are some benefits that can be extracted from this. I've talked about some of this already. One of the things I did not mention, though, is that in many instances, people are looking at this as a retention mechanism. So the ability to work remotely for a lot of people can be quite attractive, or at least to have some portion of your working week remote is also an attractive piece. All of this is about, again, creating the right experience for your employees, an experience that's focused on getting the best from them, getting their engagement, and focusing on their wellness. And all of these things can ultimately help improve the retention of people. And also to, as I said, on the good side, it can reduce absenteeism. And also there's a lot of people, and particularly our younger workers, are looking for that work-life balance. So, you know, helping them understand how to do that. Remote working can offer a great opportunity for people to do that, but there are some things that leaders need to help people, I think, figure out in that regard. So I mentioned the fact that, you know, this is now becoming more of the norm, and there is some different configurations that people are starting to think about as far as work from the office or work from anywhere is the terminology some people are using now. So, you know, my work life now could look more like working from the office with some restrictions. It could certainly be about working from home. It could also be about working from Starbucks, assuming I have the right security and all of that on my computer. But it could also be about some combination of all of those things. But there are particular considerations that become important as you start to think about those things. And so whether it's, you know, again, making sure your people have the right tools, creating a proper sense of community for your teams that are remote, and making sure that they can collaborate. Those are just some of the pieces to getting this blend of this new work from anywhere or some combination of work from the office and work from anywhere right. So one of the key considerations, and there are many, but I thought I would highlight a couple. One of the key considerations, obviously, in all of this is productivity. And so when I talk to people about working from anywhere, productivity oftentimes comes up as one of the most common concerns, and particularly for those who are working remotely. It's a concern of leaders. It's also a concern of employees because they're concerned about how they're going to be measured. And certainly it's not an easy thing, obviously, to manage. I would say the people who are most successful at it, and this goes back to that notion of trust, is where organizations have that's created or enhanced or strengthened a culture of trust. So where a culture of trust and empathy exists is typically where you see employees who feel empowered and really guided by the organization. In those instances, productivity is less a factor of sort of traditional, if I can't see you doing something, then you must not be doing it. It's more based on outcomes. I understand that you are doing something. I will look for the outcomes of what you're doing. How are you having impact? And that's what I will focus on in terms of try to measure things. But to do that, as we said, really requires employees that feel empowered. You know, in those kinds of organizations, managers are empowering employees. They're really helping them in a variety of ways. So 3 of the qualities that are really important in those kinds of organizations where there's a culture of trust and managers are empowering people is that there are clearly defined roles and team norms. So, you know, some roles are going to be easier, of course, than others. Obviously, some of the office type roles that we see are likely more remotable in nature, and that's become a verb now, more remotable in nature than other ones. Obviously, field operations ones are, you can't work from home as readily if you're in some type of field operation. However, understanding and creating those or identifying those roles that are more remotable, the ones that are sort of highly autonomous in nature, for example, those can be the ones that are more successful in terms of doing this. So, you know, that's why, though, it's really important to be very clear on roles, because without clarity on roles and sort of structure around how you're working remotely, it becomes a challenge for teams, and so people can start to step on each other, or people might be a little less clear on who's doing what because they don't have the physical proximity. All of this, though, is very eminently manageable. I'd say that the second point I want to highlight again is that organizations who have a strong outcome-based performance management system are the ones who can absolutely make this work, who can make remote work workable for them. So again, it works when people have, like, all of these 3 points on the right side of your screen work together. So where roles are clear and team norms are clearly defined, it's easier to facilitate an outcome-based system of performance. But also, too, none of this is possible unless employees have the right tools and ways to work remotely. So can they collaborate easily? Can they communicate easily with one another? All of these things become the sort of critical or cornerstone elements, if you will, of making remote work productive and making sure that it's feasible for people. So just really to kind of bring this to almost a close, in terms of leading and managing in a virtual world, it's all possible, but it does require certain things in addition to what I just talked about, whether it's sort of those kinds of management structures, but it also requires certain aspects or certain attributes and actions of leaders now more than ever. So 5 actions that I've highlighted here is, you know, first and foremost, starting at the top, modeling the way and doing it with a human touch. So, you know, really, there are ways to connect with people, to continue to stay connected with people as you work remotely. You know, part of this, as we said, is working with your teams to create a shared goal and agree on new expectations. So don't, you know, for leaders, the opportunity is here to work together to create a new set of norms and a new set of expectations for your team. You know, enabling others to act virtually, not just work virtually, but act virtually. So this is about enabling and empowering people, empowering them with clarity about what it is that they can do, decisions that they can and should be making, giving them that clarity and giving them that authority to make those things will make their work better, make it easier for them, and will get to a better result. Also, you know, focus on solutions to problems. So this is about finding those new ways, those different ways to create some structured solutions. We have an approach that we use. It's a management system is the way I describe it. It's oddly enough, it's called Perform, but one of the things we're seeing is more of an interest in using this now as people are working remotely and defining those new management problems that they as teams have to solve. We're applying this in a virtual sense to create a construct, a management system for them to solve these kinds of performance and productivity problems that they have that have become more perhaps elevated as they are virtual. And then this is just basic stuff as leaders, you know, show appreciation, celebrate success for your teams. All of these things are highly, highly doable. So just to sum, there's still some important messages for leaders that I want to share with you. First and foremost, now is the time to act. So all of these things, and I mean this not just about obviously planning for return to work, but thinking about what is that sort of next normal, the thing that will be the longer term now. There was change that was happening, obviously, even before the pandemic. The pandemic has accelerated the need to think about not only now, but the future, but it's sort of pulled the future up in a timeline. No regrets in that. So again, this is sort of a similar point. As we said, the future isn't really a fixed destination. So you need to be able to be dynamic. You need to be able to recognize, work through, and this goes back to agility and resilience, work through multiple potential future scenarios at times. And you'll need to make moves based on those things, but be able to adapt or pivot quickly with your workforce in order to adjust. Make a bigger leap. And that's really about saying, you know, let's not be constrained by where you're starting, but you know, this is an opportunity to perhaps do some different things now. Own the automation. So automation and artificial intelligence, you can't leave it to one group to really own. This is about, this whole pandemic, I think, as I said, has raised, in effect, the awareness of the need for automation, but also for the digital IQ of organizations to increase around this. This is an everybody problem. It's not just an HR problem. It's not an IT problem. You know, one of the other things that we say is people, not jobs. So we need to focus in on people. We can't protect jobs because we can't stop the pace of automation, but we do need to find ways to bring that sort of humanity into how we adapt our workforces. And then finally, building a clear narrative. A lot of people prior to the pandemic were anxious about the future of work and how they deal with it. This has heightened this even more so for people. So this is why we say now more than ever, whether people will be working back at the office or remotely, you need to have the right conversations about this. And you need to be constantly interacting with your people about this. That is my set of messages for you folks, and I am delighted to take any questions from you now.
Kathy, thank you so much. That was wonderful. As we give folks an opportunity to use the question feature in the webinar, I have my own question. You've clearly pointed out that working from anywhere, as you call it, can be productive. I think you cited 35 to 40%, which is, for me personally, not surprising. I think many of us, when we find that balance, when we feel supported, when we have the right tools, we're absolutely able to work well and successfully remotely. I just wonder if there's particular population segments, whether it's older folks like myself or younger folks that are more embracing of this new normal that we're now practicing.
It's very interesting, and I don't lead to your question. I don't know that this is scientific, but one of the things that we're doing, so I will speak to the PwC current experience and some of what I'm hearing from my clients. One of the things that we're doing, And one of the things that I strongly advocate people to do as you continue to plan back to work is to pulse your people and pulse them frequently. And by that, I mean, whatever it is, whether your organization is 500 people or whether you've got 8 people, but understand what's important to your team and what's important at this point in time, because as you track this will help you understand where people are at in terms of that ability to adapt and want to adapt. So there's the ability to adapt on the one hand, but there's also the desire. One of the things we have found is, I think it, again, very much, and this is what you find out by pulsing and understanding your people's situations, it's very much situational, very much dependent on scenarios. So we have a lot of young staff who live in high-rise apartments, and for quite some time we're very sequestered, especially if you're in Toronto. And a lot of them have found it, because their work environment is also about their social environment, have found it very confining. And those are probably some of the folks who, while they've adapted quickly from a technical standpoint, so a can they do it standpoint, they've also expressed the desire to be coming back to the workplace. Whether it's full-time is another question, but so it's about the personal factors that influence your people's experience. That's one example. I mentioned the public transportation also being a factor on whether people want to and can come back to work. The other things that also obviously affect is, kids have been off from school, for parents who have had to adjust and adapt to that. That's also probably provided some impetus to want to come back. Whether it's full-time or not, that's another story, but I'd say it's certainly a contributing factor. So it's been very circumstance related is the best conclusion I can draw for you right now. Maybe in another 6 months we'll have some clearer demographics on it, but right now that's the way it seems.
It's nothing is constant as change.
Absolutely.
We have a few questions now. Adam and Ella Rose are asking about hiring and training new employees, and specific suggestions around onboarding or orientation for folks when you're dealing with a remote environment.
And I understand that could be a tough one. So some of what we've been able to do with people and started doing with some of our clients is helping them through what we're calling the creation of virtual academies. So there's a few things that you have to understand, obviously, when you're doing this kind of onboarding. Even if you have a really good onboarding process to begin with, when we were all doing this in a physical way, that process needs to adapt, obviously, from a virtual perspective. And not just that it's going to be online, but it needs to adapt in that you have to find other ways to create a stimulating, engaging sort of environment. So just as a basic example on that, we would suggest that some of the ways people have done things is they start to gamify some of the aspects of their onboarding. That's when you're getting super creative. But if you can create, whether it's gamifying certain aspects of your onboarding, or we have tools that we use that are instant collaboration types of things. So literally a virtual whiteboard, if you can plan or co-create something with the people that you're onboarding. There's an application called Mural. I don't know if people are familiar with it, but we found it to be an incredibly effective application. But you also too, likely if you have different topics, you'll have to chunk them up. So, we know that really 60 minutes to 75 minutes is about the max that you're going to get out of somebody, probably on a single topic in a virtual format. So you just have to find ways to space and do things slightly differently if that's feasible for you. But it is eminently doable.
And I suspect that your discussion around points and engaging with people, using gamification to change the channel, so to speak, will address in some part Sandy's question around managing larger teams, say 30 or more. How do we keep them engaged? How do we keep larger groups engaged?
Oh, and such a good question. And this is, trust me, this is one of the challenges I've been living and breathing as a leader and trying to service my clients. But there are lots of tools that will allow you to do that. So one of the things that we use, for example, with larger groups is, just the capacity to even break off into virtual, sort of separate groups or, working groups during a session. There's a lot, our Google, we use Google Hangouts at PwC, for example, but it allows you facility to do that. So then you're in small subgroups, you can use the capacity to break off and then rejoin another group, just as if you would if you were physically doing it in a large session. The other thing, though, is, and I referenced this tool, Mural, and I'm not trying to do a commercial for Mural because there are other similar ones out there, but it's what I'm familiar with. This is an incredibly effective, and I've seen it used with, 25 or 30 people, where literally it's like you have your own color and your own Post-it notes, and you can virtually write your own Post-it notes in this massive virtual collaboration room on this, so that, and people can literally move them around the same way you would if you were doing it old school and trying to do it live on a big board somewhere. So there are so many ways to keep people engaged on a broad basis, particularly when you have a larger crowd. But it does take more, structure, more and different structure too, because you do have to, I think, break into the smaller groups probably a little bit more to facilitate smaller sessions if it's doable in that context.
Terrific. Well, that brings us to the top of the hour. Kathy, on behalf of the Canadian Association of Government Finance Officers, our near 7,000 members, over 100 of which were on today's webinar, I'd like to thank you. It's a very timely, very topical discussion. I've certainly learned a lot from today around making sure that we consider people first. I think we always knew that, but it is changed, and we have to accept that not all of us deal with change in the same way, and we have to honor that. I'd like to thank you. This discussion was part of CAGFO's ongoing Wednesday weekly webinar series. It's our little bit to support our members and stakeholders through this very change environment, very much change environment. We typically, with the presenter's permission, post much of the material on our website at cagfo.ca. Continue to look at the website from time to time, check out other webinars that are upcoming, and certainly look at our National Professional Development Conference being delivered this September. Kathy, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Have a good day.
You too.